dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak about the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran. We understand that Isfahan Aram Mashahi, the Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's chief of staff, will be arriving in the United States as soon as tomorrow. Mr. Mashahi is a close friend and trusted advisor of President Ahmadinejad. He is someone who has worked closely with President Ahmadinejad since 1982, when Ahmadinejad was governor in Koy in West Azerbaijan, and the Intelligence Ministry appointed Mashahi as the security team for the Kurdistan region next door. Since then, Mashahi has been a member of the Ahmadinejad inner circle. The world knows of President Ahmadinejad's public incitement against Jews and Israel, infamously including his pledge to, quote, wipe Israel off the face of the map. But the world may not know of the virulent anti-Israel and anti-Semitic views of his trusted advisor. In 2008, Mr. Mashahi told Sudanese President Bashir, quote, the corrupt and criminal Zionist regime is harming not only the Arab and Islamic world, but humanity in its entirety. In order to save humanity from its different crises, there is no other way other than limiting of Zionist influence on human society, because the root and origin of most of the world's current crises are related to Zionism. Shortly after the discredited Iranian presidential election of June 2009, Mr. Mashahi was appointed as the presidential chief of staff after a very brief and unsuccessful attempt to serve as the vice president of Iran. Since then, the persecution and repression of people in Iran has steadily increased. Thousands of peaceful protesters, dissidents, and activists have been detained after Mr. Mashahi became chief of staff. Now, let there be no doubt, Mr. Mashahi, like his president, is directly responsible for human rights abuses in Iran. He should not be granted a visa to enter the United States of America, and he, like his president, should be designated under U.S. law as a human rights abuser in Iran. Mr. Mashahi's visit will come just 4 days after the United Nations Secretary General released an interim report on human rights in Iran. The report states, quote, the human rights situation in Iran has been marked by intensified crackdowns on human rights defenders, women's rights activists, journalists, and government opponents. Concerns about torture, arbitrary detentions, and unfair trials continue to be raised by UN human rights mechanisms. Additionally, they said discrimination persisted against minority groups and in some cases amounting to persecution. They said, quote, a worrying trend is the increased number of cases in which political prisoners are accused of moharib, that is, enmity against God, an offense which under their law is punishable by death. At least 22 people charged with the moharib have been executed since January 2010 under this man's administration. Journalists, bloggers, human rights defenders, and lawyers continue to be arrested or subjected to travel bans. Blogs and websites are restricted. And now there are more than 10 national dailies that have been shut down and refused because they refused to toe the official line under this man. The concern remains over the lack of human rights, due process rights, and a failure to respect any of the rights of detainees. Particularly, the UN wrote, there are concerns expressed at routine practice of incommunicado detention, the use of torture, ill treatment and detention, the use of solitary confinement, and of individuals without any charge. Finally, they said, quote, concerns were expressed in public about people sentenced to death often who do not have access to any legal representation, and families and lawyers are not even informed of the execution. The report continues to detail Iranian persecution of religious minorities, especially those of the Baha'i faith. The report notes a concern for 6 members of the Baha'i community arrested by officials from the intelligence ministry in the months of June and July 2010, and 7 Baha'i community leaders recently sentenced to 10 years in prison. Regarding Iran's persecution of the Kurdish minority, the report notes, quote, members of the Kurdish community have continued to be executed on various national security-related charges, including Muharreb. At least 9 Kurdish political prisoners, including Jafar Kazemi, Mohammad Ali Agagi, and Ali Saraemi, were executed since 2010, and several others remain at risk of execution. Regarding Iran's persecution of Christians, we read the report also continues to be received about Christians, in particular converts, being subjected to arbitrary arrest and harassment. The Secretary General's report follows others by our own State Department and human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. While we expect the State Department to release its 2010 Country Human Rights Report on March 25th, here are a few highlights from their 2009 report on Iran. They said, quote, security forces were implicated in custodial deaths and killings of election protesters and committed other acts of politically motivated violence, including torture, beatings, and rape. The State Department wrote the government administered severely officially sanctioned punishments, including death by stoning, amputation, and flogging. Authorities responded to all demonstrations with raids on opposition activist offices. They wrote some prison facilities, including the infamous Evin prison in Tehran, were notorious for cruel and prolonged torture of political opponents of the government. Authorities also maintained, quote, unofficial, unquote, secret prisons and detention centers outside the national prison system where abuse regularly occurred. The government reportedly used torture, including prolonged solitary confinement and extreme sensory deprivation, especially on political prisoners, often in detention centers outside the control of prison authorities, including Section 209 of Evin Prison. The government threatened, harassed, and arrested individuals who posted comments critical of the government on the internet, and in some cases it reportedly confiscated passports or arrested family members. These are all official comments by our own State Department on the human rights situation in Iran just in 2009 as this man administered the Chief of Staff's office. But Amnesty International also added its voice. The 2010 report on human rights in Iran states with the following summary, quote, an intensified clampdown on political protest proceeded, and particularly following the presidential election in June, whose outcome was widely disputed, deepening the long-standing patterns of repression. Security forces, particularly the paramilitary Basij, used excessive force against demonstrators. Dozens of people were killed or fatally injured. Authorities suppressed freedom of expression to an unprecedented level, blocking mobile and terrestrial phone networks and internet communications. Well over 5,000 people have been detained by the end of the year. Many were tortured, including some who were alleged to have been raped in detention or otherwise ill-treated. Some died of their injuries. Dozens were then prosecuted in grossly unfair mass show trials. Most were sentenced to prison terms, but at least 6 were sentenced to death. Amnesty goes on. The election-related violations occurred against a background of severe repression, which persisted through 2009 and whose victims included members of ethnic and religious minorities, students, human rights defenders, and advocates of political reform. Women continued to face severe discrimination under the law and in practice, and women's rights campaigners were harassed, arrested, and imprisoned. Torture and other ill treatment of detainees remained rife, and at least 12 people died in custody. Detainees were systematically denied access to lawyers, medical care, and their families, and many faced unfair trials. Now, other groups have weighed in, particularly Human Rights Watch, who wrote in their 2011 report, quote, Iran's human rights crisis deepened as the government sought to consolidate its power following the 2009 disputed presidential election. Public demonstrations waned after security forces used live ammunition to suppress protesters in late 2009, resulting in the death of at least 7 protesters. And I would add, we all remember Nada, who was killed online. Authorities announced their security forces had arrested more than 6,000 individuals after June 2009. Hundreds, including lawyers, rights defenders, journalists, civil society activists, and opposition leaders, remain in detention without charge. Since the election crackdown last year, well over 1,000 people have fled Iran to seek asylum in neighboring countries. Interrogators used torture to extract confessions, and the judiciary relied on sentencing people to long prison terms and death sentences. Restrictions on freedom of expression and association, as well as religious and other gender-based discrimination, continue unabated. The report continued, authorities systemically used torture to coerce confessions. Student activist Abdullah Momeni wrote to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei in September describing the torture he suffered at the hands of jailers. At this writing, no high-level official has been prosecuted for torture, ill treatment, and deaths of the 3 detainees held at Kazrak Detention Center after June 2009. We should not let these violations go unnoticed, nor can we continue to turn a blind eye to countless prisoners of conscience fighting for basic human dignity under this brutal dictatorship. It's time we make a stand for people like Nasreen Sotoudeh, detained for her work as a human rights lawyer, a human rights activist, and defender of children who face capital charges. Hossein Ronagi Mayalig, who is detained for his work as a blogger and human rights activist. He has been refused medical treatment despite kidney failure. Fariba Kalambadi, Jamal Mukin Kanjani, Afif Naemi, Saeed Razei, Behruz Tav Ak-Koli, Vahid Tizfam, and Mavash Sabet. These are all detained leaders of the Baha'i community, jailed solely for their Baha'i faith. Now, as of today, the precise whereabouts of opposition leaders, Mehdi Karoubi and Mir Hossein Mousavi, and their respective wives, remain unknown following their arrest and detention in February. Meanwhile, according to international human rights organizations, the whereabouts of hundreds of Iranians, including journalists and political activists, arrested just before the February 14th opposition protests remain unknown. To each of them, I would echo President Reagan's words. I came here to give you strength, but it is you who have strengthened me. Now, as we approach Iran's New Year celebration of Nowruz, it's important for the President to demonstrate our administration's commitment to the human rights of the people of Iran. We know that the Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and the Iranian Presidential Chief of Staff Mashai and other senior government officials are directly responsible and complicit in ordering, controlling, or otherwise directing the commission of serious human rights abuses against the people of Iran on or after June 12, 2009. Now, pursuant to Executive Order 13553 and the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act of 2010, the President should designate these individuals as human rights abusers and affirm core American values of freedom, democracy, and human rights. And I would just end by quoting from Section 105 of the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act of 2010, signed by the President into law last year. It requires that the executive branch produce a list of persons who are responsible or complicit in certain human rights abuses. It says not later than 90 days after the enactment of this act, the President shall submit to appropriate congressional committees a list of persons who are officials of the government of Iran or persons acting on behalf of the government, including members of paramilitary organizations such as Ansar-e-Hezbollah and the Bashti Mostafin, that the President determines, based on credible evidence, are responsible for or complicit in or responsible for ordering, controlling, or otherwise directing the commission of serious human rights abuses against the citizens of Iran or their family members on or after June 12, 2009, regardless of whether such abuses occurred in Iran or not. Clearly, this official about to arrive in the United States meets the standard under Section 105 of CISADA, and the U.S. administration should designate him as an abuser of human rights. He should not be admitted entry into the United States, and we should call it the way we see it, which is this is one of the most dangerous and human rights abusing officials that we know of. Comprehensive data now exists from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, even from the United Nations, on what this man has directed. He should not be given a visa, and he should be so listed under U.S. law. And with that, I yield back.